What's up, guys? Sean at Shock Surplus here. We are going to talk just a little bit about overlanding and the suspension that you guys kind of should just consider when you're starting out. We get a lot of customer inquiries, a lot of people asking us, what the best off-road shock is, what the best overlanding shock is. That's just too broad of an approach to start off with. Really, here's what you do. You kind of look at, how much experience do you have? Is it your first truck? Is it your first Jeep? Is it your first Tacoma? What kind of budget are you looking for? Are you hitting just the campsites, or are you really trying to go way out there to where your previous Acura wasn't able to get before? All of these are kind of the big considerations before you even start to research your first suspension upgrade. When looking into kind of a possible options, if you have a very popular application like a Wrangler or a Ram or a Tacoma or a 4Runner, Ranger F-150, there's gobs of options. So many options, it kind of makes your head spin, and you're trying to figure out, hey, what's the difference between all of these shocks, all of these suspensions? So we're going to just kind of dive into a little bit of the basics here. This is going to be kind of probably a 2 or 3 part series, so we're going to answer the basics here at the outset. Typically, when you're thinking about an off-road shock or an overlanding shock, you're kind of thinking a shock that's going to handle more weight than what your vehicle is normally carrying on a day-to-day daily driver basis. We know a lot of you guys are daily driving your rigs, and then on the weekends or a week-long trip, you guys are loading it up with a bunch of stuff and going far off. So you usually need, dependability is the first really factor in deciding on a off-road and overlanding shock. A lot of shocks, you can go off-road with almost any shock. If the factory shocks, you could go off-road. You go overlanding with all factory parts. We're out here pretty far off grid, and this truck still has factory suspension with a little bit of a takeoff RS 9000 Rancho shock. So you can get there, you can get a lot of places. It really comes down to how fast do you want to get there, and how much gear are you loading up in order to get there. We are about probably a quarter of the usual load we have when we pack up the family and we would pack up for a week-long trip or a 2-week trip. Usually this thing is stacked to the gills with stuff on the top. Likewise, if you are in the same position, then you want to maybe consider a good upgraded monotube gas shock, something that's going to last a long time. We are big fans of adjustable shocks. So I brought out a few different options here that we kind of recommend to our customers, and this is just to set you on your path. These aren't definitive answers for your exact vehicle. We're just going to kind of talk about the features and how it kind of helps with a heavily loaded down vehicle that's seeing kind of terrain that you're maybe not used to, a lot bumpier than you're used to. But don't fret, your factory vehicle can go many places that you may not have thought about before. So getting into here, these are the takeoff Bilsteins that were on this Ram. Bilstein has their 4600 series that are come factory standard on a bunch of models, like the 4Runners, the Tacomas, these power wagons. A bunch of different vehicles kind of feature the famous yellow shock. This is a monotube shock, monotube gas, and it is digressively valved, which means that at the beginning ranges of motion, it's a bit firmer than a typical twin tube factory shock. And that's because Bilstein likes to give it a little bit of a sporty ride, whatever application it's going on. And by sporty, so it's not soft and plush, but it's quite controlled, keeps you very planted on the highways and the pavement. Pretty good bump compliance, usually better than any kind of factory black, very thin shock. That's because the rebound in these is a lot better and more consistent to help out with the speed bumps and the potholes and the highway joints. So if you're on a budget, these are such a good option. They will last a long time, and you can beat them up quite a bit. Many people are getting 100,000 miles out of these shocks, and you could get a set of these for about $300 for a truck like this or a Jeep Wrangler. If you're a strut equipped truck, it's going to be a little bit more, but that's just the nature of strut equipped trucks. A little bit of an upgrade version of here is the Bilstein 5100. Now, most people really like the silver. So they're always asking us, do you guys have the 5100s in a factory height for my vehicle? And a lot of times, yes, they are available. So you might be wondering what's the difference between those two. Now, the thickness is basically identical. Both run a 46 millimeter digressive piston. So tuned almost exactly the same. The only difference is these are a little bit better for heavier wheel and tire packages or taller vehicle stands. So Bilstein tunes these so that the body roll is reduced when on a taller vehicle, and the rebound and compression damping is more appropriate for oversized wheel and tires. On something like this, where we're running 37s on factory suspension, the factory shocks are tuned for 33s, not for 37s and much heavier wheels. So Bilstein takes that into account when they're designing their 5100s. We have a video that goes more into detail on the differences and similarities of these, but just to be brief, they're almost exactly the same, but these are a little bit more HD for heavier vehicles, heavier wheels and tires. And one thing that we're also noticing a lot of is people wanting to splurge on the best of the best. Now, people look at a King shock, they look at all the off-road race trucks with these Kings on them, and they must obviously be the best for all situations. And that's just not correct. King, their tuning is, you can get everything custom tuned on a King shock, but off the shelf, these have a little bit of a progressive nature to them, which means that the beginning ranges of motion are quite a bit looser, and they allow the coil springs on the vehicle to do the compression damping for you. And when you start reaching the max end ranges of the shock is where the valving really comes into play to slow down the shock shaft and your suspension. On an overlanding vehicle, that's not what we want. You don't want, honestly, you don't want that because that's going to allow your vehicle to do a lot of body roll in the slower speed trails. Whereas Bilstein, it's going to reduce the body roll. Bilstein may not be able to take the hard hits like a King shock will. And these would typically be more plush. That's because the shocks are allowing the beginning ranges of motion to have very little resistance. And so that's what, you can't have a plush, it's very hard to have a plush ride, but also have a controlled ride. You could get a really soft shock. Everyone wants a really plush, soft, comfortable ride, but we can give you one of those, but that's gonna equate to a lot of body roll. So when you're handling loads on an overland setup, you want a lot of control and maybe not so much on the comfort side. So just keep that in mind, that the price tag does not equate to being the best for all situations in all vehicles. Very expensive shocks, and we frequently talk people out of these because it's overkill. Another consideration is typically sometimes, you know, we have a 2.5 option here. These are our old takeoffs off of our Tacoma. So these are the Icon 2.5 CDCV valved compression damping controlled shocks. What that means is that these reservoirs have an adjustment knob right here that controls how firm or how soft the shock is going to respond to the terrain. Much thicker, obviously, than all of these options. A 2.5 inch shock is usually top of the line for most applications. Some applications are getting into 3.0s, but once again, very overkill unless you're high speed overlanding. Very few people are. What's great is that these shocks are kind of a buy it for life kind of situation. The adjustability means that you can adjust for the daily drive to be very soft highways, predictable pavement ride. You could make these really soft, it's going to be plush, and when you're unloaded, you're not too worried about body roll. Now, when you're loaded up, another 500 pounds, 800 pounds, 1,000 pounds for an overland trip, a week-long trip. You can adjust these down, you can adjust these as firm as you want to both reduce body roll on the pavement. I like to run the shocks tight when we're on mountain roads, because a lot of twisty mountain roads, you're going to get a lot of body roll, and I just don't like that for my own vehicle, and a lot of you are the same. You can make these also a bit firmer on the trail. So if you are doing a little bit of a high speed kind of situation, 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, higher, firmer compression damping is going to reduce heavily that bottom out action. And bottoming out means that when you're hitting kind of an obstacle or a surprise in the trail, and that front end kind of dips hard, you get that clunk, and then you rebound high. A firmer setting on these is going to reduce that action and keep it way more in control, reduce the bottom out drastically, if at all. So a huge fan of adjustable shocks. This Ram right now has a RS 9000 adjustable shocks on it, which I wouldn't have typically recommended in the past, but the main purpose of getting this Ram Power Wagon was so that we can test out a wider range of shocks. And the RS 9000s have actually surprised me personally with how well they do in a bunch of different situations. When I'm daily driving this thing, I turn them to soft and it's super plush. A lot of body roll, which I don't like, but it's nice when the family's in and we're all just cruising. When we hit the trails, or we're doing the highway, not the highway, but the mountain roads, the mountain passes, which you guys will see a lot of on this, is reducing body roll is paramount when this thing is loaded up and we got stuff on top. Plus on the higher speed stuff, we like to take the trails a little bit more spirited. So making them firm, making adjustable shocks firm, you don't have to worry about unpredictable terrain, because yeah, it's not going to be uncomfortable, but it's going to keep your vehicle planted. Let's keep that in an overall sense of what we're talking about here. We're talking about traction and vehicle control when you're talking about good shocks. If you really want to get into the ultimate in comfort and good vehicle control, that'll be in our next episode, where we get a lot more deep into specific suspension setups, what different spring rates kind of mean for you, and how far down the rabbit hole you can get on adjustable shocks. So just to cap it off, really you can start with the basic $300 set of shocks, $300 to $400 to get going, just to get out there. You know, we always recommend just to start very easily. Don't think for months and months on what shocks to get perfect. You know, get them right now. Get them right now and go. That's always just the best recommendation we can always get, because you spend $300 on some shocks, you get out there and you find out, hey, most of the stuff that I'm doing is super easy. And now you got all that extra money. Instead of spending on Kings, instead of spending on 2.5s, you have another $1,000, $2,000 to put towards better gear to make your camping setup money. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned. We are going to have a part 2 of this, where we dive more into specific suspension recommendations and rebound and compression adjustment shocks, internal bypass shocks, all the fancy things that are coming out. We're going to get into that later. Let us know in the comments what you want to see. Give us a thumbs up. We appreciate you guys watching. Thanks so much.